So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be joining us from. So my name is Olympia Pilch and I am the co-founder and chief operating officer of the Critical Minerals International Alliance. So unfortunately, Jeff is having some technical issues at the moment. So if he can join us, he'll be taking over the moderation. But for now, I hope he'll be okay with me jumping in. So I'm joined by wonderful panelists today, which I'm going to hand over to soon to introduce themselves as we talk about ASM and the challenges we face within the critical supply chains and how ASM could potentially be one of the solutions. So I'm going to just hand over now to the panelists to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Rosanna. If you could just give us a quick overview about your background.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olympia. And thank you everyone else for joining also this session today and for the fellow panelists to also be in the discussion. So my name is Rosanna Tufo and I'm a senior advisor at Living Sources. Living Sources is a B Corporation social venture and consultancy firm, which is focused on specialized on responsible minerals value chain for over a decade now, about 15 years since Estelle Levin-Nunley founded the company. I myself have been with the company over six years. I'm an economist by training, but then really specialized on responsible business conduct. And in particular, Living Sources, I've been leading projects with several clients on research projects, but also advising on responsible sourcing strategy for ASM, but also working with government on fund formalization and other research endeavors for ASM, and more recently, more on critical raw materials. So I'll certainly share more of that during this discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us. David, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name's David Livingstone. I'm an independent consultant, and I've been working with Jeff on critical minerals for about 5 years. I've been in critical minerals for about the same time, about 5 years. I've been 15 years in space technologies, and I think that's quite an interesting conjunction, and in cybersecurity for a grand total of 30 years. And I think it's going to be very interesting how we can provide better assurance to critical mineral supply chains, particularly as they're sort of reorganizing themselves, to reduce dependency on China and so on. I've been a Chatham House Fellow on the International Security Program since 2005. And I offset my company's carbon footprint by buying seaweed.
That's quite interesting and very impressive biography there.
Thanks.
So Terry, would you like to come next?
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation and for setting up the panel and the very interesting discussions we're going to have in a few minutes. So thank you for all of that. My name is Terry Gard. Born and raised in Zimbabwe. I went to study mining engineering at the University of the Witwatersrand, went back up and worked in the large-scale mining sector in Zimbabwe for most of my adult life. I got a master's degree in business, and then I had an opportunity to work for the World Bank in Afghanistan in the Ministry of Mining and Petroleum. So I left Zimbabwe for the first time, worked there for a few years, and then came across to the UK, where I commenced a PhD looking at mining and justice, really. And from that point, I've been making myself available as a consultant in any shape I can in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. I should just quickly add that I met Estelle Levin, who put me on to Gavin Hilson, who was my co-supervisor during my PhD, and so I appreciate Living Sources very much. Thank you.
It's a very small world in the critical mineral sector, isn't it? Thank you for that, Terry. So Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Olympia, and I really appreciate the session you've helped organize, and I appreciate all the co-panelists. So I'm the mining partner at the Blended Capital Group, focused on artisanal mining formalization, delivering dignity and value across the huge sector. Critical minerals are, of course, a big chunk of that, given that there's supply shortfalls, copper, cobalt, so on. So the opportunities to build that supply, bridge those gaps, while delivering social outcomes in ways that make commercial sense. So my background's corporate finance. I was in different finance leadership roles in and beyond the DuPont company for about 30 years. And as I've joined the Blended Capital Group, we've built a consortium that's geared towards delivering value on the ground as we talk to strategic investors who are going to deliver the financing that goes hand in hand with the work on the ground. So really looking forward to the next hour or so and a great conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So now we're just going to take a step back and actually think about what ASM is, some of the misconceptions. So those of you who are experts and have been involved in the sector for quite a while, please bear with us as we give a brief primer to those who are joining us from a completely new space. So Rosanna, over to you if you'd like to just take us through ASM.
Thank you, Olympia. And can I just check that the technology worked as we planned?
Absolutely, it's all working well.
Perfect. That's nice when it helps. Okay, yes. So I think, today the topic of today's discussion is really, it's what sounds something that is quite complex, and probably we're not going to have one answer to this very complex and important question today. So we said, let's probably start with some comfort. Let's start with probably from the basics. And the basics for people who like research or like defining things is definitions, right? So when it comes to ASM, and I'll try to move my slides, there you go. Of course, there is still ongoing debate about what the sector means and what this term that we use to really summarize a large group of people and different type of economic operations means. But for the let's say simplicity of conversation today, we'll refer to the OECD definition, which really talks about artisanal and small-scale mining, both as formal or informal operations, which are predominantly using forms of exploration, extraction, processing, and transformation, which are rudimentary, artisanal, based on low capital, so not very huge investments as we can think, for example, in the large-scale sector, and they use high labor, a lot of labor, so a lot of employment generated at the first stages of the artisanal small-scale mining value chains. In terms of who is part of the sector, it's really a variety of individuals and groups. It can be small groups that work jointly together, as it can be like larger organizations, associations of miners that come together, again, either formally or informally, to work on a specific location and to extract several minerals. This is just sort of like I wanted to give a visual about the diversity that we're talking about when we speak about ASM, because we need to think about really different scales, right, of operations, from the pure rudimentary ones and therefore like just shuffles and picks, very basic tool, to some semi-mechanization or even some structured tunnels and mining setup is still remaining at quite small scale. So photo taking in some of the pictures that we took over the years to really give that diversity and of what it can look like in practice, and just to put some pictures and some images to the words. When we think about key facts and figures, of course, this is now a sector that has also been largely researched and talked about, and we'll probably discuss today that more so on other commodities rather than critical minerals. But there are some numbers out there that give us at least a sense of why this sector is important and potentially why we're talking about it today. So when you look at key facts and figures, probably it's good to think about two key indicators. One is potentially the people who are involved. So how does this fit into the global economy? And when I say global, it's actually talking about many rural, local, and regional economies, and therefore people involved in it, but also like then the mineral outcome. So how does the sector also contribute economically to mineral supply chains? Latest estimates about the sector really count around, even more nowadays, for more than 44 million people across 80 countries around the world involved directly in the ASM sector, with more than 100 million really involved in activities that are related to the sector. To this, it's usually coupled also with the data of how many people depend on the sector, even if they don't work directly in it. 150 million depend on it from family members and relatives and other people who might support. So quite impressive and important numbers that we always repeat when we speak about ASM, but I think they're very important to set the scenes. some specific numbers also on the African continent, and I'll explain why I focus also on that, because we've done some recent research in particular on critical raw materials about on the African continent. When you speak about the minerals, and here's probably where we start making the link to today's discussion, historically, we know that the ASM sector has been mostly involved in commodities such as gold, diamonds, and different gemstones. And when we talk about critical raw materials, it's been mainly cobalt, copper, the 3 Ts, but potentially also others as we discussed today. So the fact that the focus so far has been mostly on gold, diamonds, and gemstone, for example, this is going to tell us different things when we try to define the contribution toward critical raw materials, not least because the major attention has been on this commodity so far, and therefore that's probably where we have more qualitative data, at least, although not always quantitative. Nevertheless, as I showed on the right side of the slides, there is still some important contribution based on latest estimations of the sector to not only, as I said, diamond, gold, and gemstones, but also to cobalt production, like, for example, in the DRC, as many of us in the call will be aware, but also the 3 Ts, tantalum, tin, and tungsten, and some indicators of involvement in manganese and lithium, for example, but with less specific figures. One other important characteristic of the sector is always defined as operating in the informal economy. And here I would just like to drop one piece of reflection, that is a sector that still then is within a broader, let's say, group or a broader family of informal workers, which is estimated at 1.6 billion by the ILO. And therefore, we often sort of define it as ASM being informal, but is not the only sector most likely in the economies that we're looking at that works outside of the formal economy. So I think this is going to be very important for today's discussion. So I really wanted to mention that. And speaking about formality, we often at Living Sources, this is like a sort of definition or picture, let's say, that we've put together now a few years back, but we keep using it because we really like to show it the diversity of the ASM sector when it comes to their legal form, how they operate, and that it's much more than a legal or illegal setting, as we often see in many journals, in many publications outside, where, you know, sometimes the informal sector is the ASM by definition, and it's not probably that. So we like to really look at the difference between illegal in particular and informal, where illegal is something definitely prohibited by law, while informal or like informal is more like that not all the requirements are met, and sometimes there are specific conditions why that is not happening. Again, all this, I think, just launching there are some reflections that hopefully are going to help for today's discussion. And to conclude on a note that is definitely on the point of today's topic, at Living Sources, we recently concluded an overview of 15 countries in the African continent and their the interaction between ASM and critical raw materials. We have done that in the framework of a EU-funded project called Africa Mobile, which looks at partnerships between Africa and the EU. And we've done so by looking really how the ASM sector currently is set up when it comes to critical raw materials, who is involved, how do the value chains work, what are the challenges, and what are the key investment needs and opportunities. This table here just summarizes some of the key data, is not exhaustive, and is based on some analysis that one of the partners of the project has done, being BGR, on the economic and geological, in particular, potential of ASM to also mine critical materials in these African countries. So just a snapshot, I won't go into the details of this, but just to say that this discussion is definitely timely, and I'm very looking forward to discuss with the other panelists. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Rosanna. That was a wonderful oversight. And my mind is still stuck on the sheer number of people involved in the sector. And of course, when we talk about the energy transition, we talk about building a better tomorrow with critical minerals. But the reality on the ground is that those minerals have to come from somewhere. We have huge supply chain issues with monopoly being held by China on a lot of these critical minerals, especially in the midstream. So my question to you is, how do we move forward? How do we incorporate ASM into critical mineral supply chains? is there a way to formalize the sector? Should we be looking at jurisdiction-specific approaches? How does it, for example, differ to be looking at formalization in Africa versus, for example, Asia, etc.? So over to you. If anyone wants to kick off before I pick on someone.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot and get going. And that was a great overview from Rosanna. And the bottom line is the sector's huge. The sector's incredibly geographically diverse, incredibly culturally diverse, incredibly economically diverse. So the question when I think about formalization, what's lacking and what needs to be put in place in order to deliver changes and outcomes? And changes and outcomes meaning social outcomes, meaning productivity, meaning ecological protection. So one thing that needs to be delivered that's lacking is investment access. So notionally a financing marketplace with investment instruments that make sense given the nature of the sector. Another thing that needs to be delivered is, in order to formalize, the sector needs to be deemed legal. Well, why wouldn't it be? It's historically traditional. It historically extends from communities. So making sure that legal framework reflects the realities on the ground matters. And then the third piece of the puzzle, because it's a triad in my mind, is fit for purpose engagement. So what that means is flexible frameworks that engage different places in different ways, given the realities on the ground. The DRC is not Peru. Neither one of those places are Indonesia. So reflecting that in the way we go in the way we engage in solution designs, all of that's about success given an investment marketplace. So at the end of the day, what are you delivering? Well, formalization is about stable, predictable business relationships. It's about governance. It's about capacity. It's about stability on the ground relative to the broader local ecosystem. And because the broader local ecosystem is different place by place, it's about engaging in a way that makes sense, which is going to look different in places. So my simple perspectives, going after those gaps and getting at them at scale, is all about delivering impact at scale and productivity at scale for critical minerals related ASM and broader ASM.
Harry, I think you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think what is some of the this idea of common misconceptions. I think to treat the global critical mineral ASM supply market as a single entity, which would be very useful because that would attract an awful lot of investment, because the the return on investment of engaging with companies and governments. But it's really much more like a current bun, where you've got these sort of lovely currents. Those are all the sort of producing mines and producing regions and so on. But the current bun, but the rest of it is all about the sort of connections of how all those currents in the bun are actually molded together. At the moment, the quality of the bun, the dough in the bun, is lacking the essence of water, which is the liquidity of the finance mechanisms throughout the world. So really got to be sort of veering away from behaving, or us seeing the ASM, global ASM sector as a single coherent supply market.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that keeps coming out of the discussions, is we either tend to focus on gold or ASM as a whole for the different commodities. But we are quite familiar with the challenges facing cobalt, for example. But when it comes to lithium and manganese, as Rosanna pointed out, we don't quite have the numbers. We don't quite fully understand how it all interacts together. So I think we had a great email exchange as well about, how do we drive the change? how do we implement some of the solutions? So I'm not sure if Rosanna, you wanted to come in there or you wanted to add to a previous point by David.
Maybe I can try to join the two. Let's try that. Yeah, maybe making a link. Yeah, so I think very, very good point raised by both Rob and David. And I think it really also, I'll start probably from one point, the point from Rob about formalization, right? Is something that is often talked about in the sector. And I think we need to recognize the many initiatives also that are work towards formalization, in particular in the gold sector, which is probably where we have most evidence, but also like in diamonds. And initiatives that are also racing now in the cobalt. But I think also formalization probably should not be seen as the only solution, right, for the sector. It's a much more complex dynamics, as Rob also mentioned, looking at the broader economics, ecosystems, recognizing the ASM as an economic actor in its own right. And when I say ASM, really the different actors in the different countries, how they contribute to the local and rural economy. I think this is also another aspect that we need to think about. I mean, we're looking at operators that work in economies that are often underdeveloped, where like economic alternatives are scarce. And therefore, like they see like really the ASM sector has an opportunity or sometimes the only livelihood option available, or at least in like we see in gold, the most profitable one. So I think also taking more an economic and socioeconomic probably development angle to start reflecting of what is the role that the ASM sector can play. And formalization is certainly a point in that, but probably not. We have been focusing, I think, in the sector a lot on formalization as we think that once we formalize, the rest all falls into place. But then we also need to raise questions about the motivation of formalization. For example, having worked with several projects that also looked at formalization, one of the things that is often clear is the disconnect between what formalization itself means for miners, for example, like what is important to them, what is important to government, that maybe they're focused on revenues generation, what is important to miners, which is usually getting access to better equipment. And as Rob said, again, finance. I think I really like us also to reflect in this group about the importance of capital for the ASM, because often, and Rob, I would really like to hear also your thoughts from the financial sector as well, right? It's a challenge that we keep hearing about, the fact that even artisanal small-scale mining to operate, they need some sort of financing. And at the moment where that is found is in the informal supply chains, or like by entrepreneurs that ad hoc finance operations, and then they're also benefiting from the production that then it's harder to track and to take back to certain supply chains. So I think the finance is another big challenge, but also an entry point to look at. Now looking at your other question, Olympia, really, how do we start addressing the challenges, but also thinking more creatively about recognizing the sector as an economic actor and thinking about the financing aspect as well. Absolutely. From the private sector, but also the public. Sorry.
Yeah. If I could just come in before going on to finance, just returning to the topic at the moment, which is to see formalization as a verb, and then to pick up on the idea that Rosanna mentioned about there being a spectrum, which could start at the one end being illicit, that which is really where the money raised goes into some sort of criminal activities or funding rebels, across the spectrum to legal, and formalization being the verb that drives the change across from illicit on the one hand to legal on the other, and formal being one of those states that you can be in between. And then picking up on Jeff's analogy of the current bun, the thing is that no two countries, no two minerals, no two situations are the same along that spectrum. And each operation that I've seen in my own life and read a number about falls pretty much in one part or other part of that spectrum, but they are very different when it comes to their own capacity and context for formalization. And so we need to start where the miners are and have the words perhaps destination legal, and think of it as being where we want to end up, but not necessarily going to get there immediately or as a pre-action before anything else happens. And so if we keep the word formalization as a verb, keep the idea of the spectrum, and keep moving our miners towards the legal end of the spectrum, I think that's the way forward for us.
And that is done over a period of time.
Yeah.
Because a jurisdiction saying, right, here are the new rules, everyone's got to obey them and all that kind of stuff. It ain't going to happen because there'll just be mass disobedience.
Definitely. And that brings me to my next question with who is responsible for this? Is it purely on governments? Should companies in the private sector be more involved in that legalization process and the finance aspect? Where does the responsibility lie from your opinion?
It varies. I mean, to me, the answer is yes, everyone, and but more detailed, it varies because at the end of the day, what do you have? You have this massive footprint. So Rosanna rattled off a bunch of numbers: 40 some odd million miners, a couple of 100 million dependents. That's 2.5% of humanity who are directly and fully supported by ASM, and another 134 to 269 million people who sell goods and services into the sector. So again, that's another couple of percent of humanity. So do governments have a role? Well, of course they do. There's massive public policy opportunity here. And the public policy opportunity is from two perspectives. It's one of its development in human rights, we'll say, because the footprint's so massive, and the other is critical mineral supply and economic and energy security driven off of that. So along with governments, do others have horse in the water? Well, yeah. So number one, ASM often shares land with large-scale mines, large mining projects. So is there an opportunity for large-scale miners to be at the table and to deliver value for themselves as well as for local value and to ASM through collaboration? Of course. It's all about figuring out the equation given the local realities of how to collaborate, how to drive to joint productivities, and how to gradually build capacity. Along with that, is there a massive opportunity for investors? Well, 2.5% of the world is directly fully supported by this sector. So yeah, getting past the misconceptions around risk, around whether the nature of the sector in terms of legalization, around the opportunities in the sector, around the diversity of the sector, all of a sudden investors can target it in ways that make sense. And it's going to make sense in different places in different ways, and even downstream value chains. So if you're a refiner or you're an end customer, well, you're refining product that was artisanally mined. You know it's responsible. Are you collaborating with them upstream? If you're using the product in your watch or in your windmill or in your battery, do you know that was responsibly mined? Are you collaborating to change outcomes in the ground? So there's very much a village mentality to this, where the opportunity is collaborative participation towards outcome shifts.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of makes me think about, well, someone needs to take the leadership on this. Is there a body, is there a government that is doing perhaps particularly well or stands out, or a consortium that has done very well in the space? How has industry engaged as well? Has it been a little bit patchy? I'm guessing the answer is it varies. Some companies are doing excellent work and others are just not engaging in the sector. But what are some of the solutions here? We know what the challenges are. We know there's a long way to go before we can genuinely say, we're building an energy transition that does provide development that treats the people who are physically extracting these critical minerals fairly. But how do we get to that point? And especially with finance, Rob, is there a way that investors and companies can be motivated or incentivized to work more or take a little bit more proactive approach, for example, to engaging with the ASM sector?
So you've hit the nail on the head when it comes to the intent with the Blended Capital Group and their consortium, because at the end of the day, there are misconceptions today. The sector's invisible. A lot of people I talk to, I throw out the numbers: 45 million miners, couple of 100 million fully supported. Their jaw drops. They don't know that. they don't understand the implications around legality. They don't understand the implications around risk and how diversified formalization portfolios can lower risk. So the exact intent of what we're doing with at the Blended Capital Group, working with Napier Meridian, with BenQ, with 11 Sources, and with the Alliance for Responsible Mining, is to build that awareness in that investment marketplace so that people can engage in a targeted way. Because once investors get it, and getting it means that there's economic as well as social opportunities that make sense given the inherent risks, then investors get interested quickly, or can get interested quickly, because we can solve real world problems while adding economic value to them. Is it patient capital? Is it an impact investment basis? All those buzzwords? Well, maybe. It situationally varies. But part of the point is it's spelling out the reality that gets past misconceptions so that an investment marketplace can function in an effective way, given the intent on the ground being to add productivity as well as social gains that boil down to dignity and human rights.
Rob, is that the investment? And maybe Terry, you could answer as well, and maybe Marizanne. Is that because there isn't almost like a comprehensive understanding about the mechanisms of international supply chains of the critical minerals? That it's all opaque, and some of it's hidden, some of it's very clear, but the investors can't see the big picture, and therefore won't put the money on the money in any great collaborative way, i.e. through PRI or Climate Action 100+ and those sort of kind of groups.
I think you're quite right there, David, to say that the word that Olympia used earlier is a very strong word, responsible. Who's responsible for this? And that very word drives away people when the second word, as you've just used now, is opaque. And so people don't want to be responsible in a situation that is equally perceived to be opaque. And I think we need to rethink the words that we use here and start using words like, how can we collaborate with formalization? And that word collaboration has also been used by Rob in the last few minutes. And it's in that collaboration that we avoid allocating responsibility. And I think it's really important that we start thinking through how can we collaborate with the sector, and Rob's very much driving that. And it is, as you've just said, David, a very opaque sector that does need a new narrative. It does need more visibility, to use Rob's word as well. But it's really about thinking through how can we collaborate to improve the situation where critical minerals and artisanal mining are concerned. Thanks.
No, that's an excellent point. And moving away from, placing the responsibility, which is often associated with blame if things go wrong, to focusing more on a collaborative approach. Rosella, do you want to come in there?
Yes, I think that's a great point, Harry. Thank you to build on, right? Because I think recognizing the role that different actors have to play, it's crucial for this discussion. And it's not only their roles, but also closing, to me, more than making light about the opaqueness of the sector, is also about closing the current distance, right? Because here we're talking really about a variety of actors, from US, EU governments making policies about critical raw materials, supply security, because this is really one of the hot topics of most governments today, because they have to respond to their industries. And on the other hand, very local and regional administrations who would see the economic sector, that is the ASM sector, have to somehow to manage it. So I think there is also a physical distance between these policies made at different points, internationally, locally, and then what it translates into where these economies and activities take place. In particular, for example, what in the analysis that we have done across the 15 African countries, one thing that really struck our attention was the lack of recognition of the ASM sector as a strategic economic development opportunity for the countries that we looked at in the African continent. And why that is important, because if we don't start seeing, like, if locally there is not this view of the opportunity that this means for life of people, for creating employment, for eradicating poverty, there is also a gap in the discourse that we are having, right? So here is where the different roles come together. There has to be a better way from international organizations, from industry, private sector, to integrate, to start speaking about the sector, to start making an effort to understand the sector in the different places. Also, stopping maybe identification with specific narratives that we know, right? For example, certain countries are very well known for their challenges when it comes to ASM, but that doesn't mean that characterizes all ASM sector in all the different jurisdictions, right? So also making justice a little bit to what the realities on the ground are. But at the same time, engagement with governments who hold their development plans and you know, they really are key actors in the discussion, not necessarily the sole responsible, but a key actor.
The virtuous circle that we're looking for and driving towards is one where there's more transparency and it drives more collaboration. The two go hand in hand, because today there's myriad reporting standards, myriad standard setters. ASM, for the most part, with exceptions, isn't on the table. People fundamentally don't understand it. Traceability is lacking. So if you're an investor or you're a downstream supply chain participant, you're going to be scared. You're not going to want to be at the table because you don't understand it. So breaking that cycle starts with creating more transparency, better understanding of the sector, more aligned expectations. The work of the UN Mining 2030 Investor Commission, you know, Adam Matthews and all of that is so important with that. And at the end of the day, where does that get to? When people understand something better, they can plug into it, dial into it, and put their oar in the water in a collaborative way. Because all of a sudden you understand what this is all about, what it means to you, what the risks look like, and how you can manage those risks. So it really is a duality where those two things go together. And at the end of the day, breaking the vicious circle where invisibility leads to lack of participation is all about creating visibility that enables participation.
Absolutely. And this kind of brings me to a question that's been floating around in my head as you guys have been talking and giving your insights is, do we have enough of a consumer buy-in? So when we talk about critical minerals, we're normally talking about EVs and batteries and some of this tech or mobile phones. Now, I get the sense personally that some consumers are actually put off if they know that critical minerals or any minerals have been mined through artisanal mining. Do we think there is perhaps an educational piece to be done with the wider public about actually, well, this isn't terrible. It's not just purely children digging in the Congo. It is a sector that needs to be recognised. And perhaps there is a wider education piece of actually driving that from the demand side and focusing on perhaps professionalisation of the sector rather than just formalisation as well. Or I could be completely wrong on this, so please correct me.
I think you're right when it comes to some consumer goods, such as jewelry and other very easily traceable products. But when it comes to very high-tech products, people don't really stop and think about it as much as they used to, if they are at all now. And the more complicated the device that's being bought, the more complicated it is to trace all the bits and pieces that go into that device now. And I think that there is a tapering off now of interest in things like fair trade and other attempts of the last 20 years to mark products traceably, ethically, provenance being of importance, as things have got more complicated. So I think in the critical mineral sector, which is about the green revolution and about low carbon technology, there's probably less interest than there is in food, clothing and jewelry.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's a problem not just for ASM, but critical mineral supply chains in general, where most people don't actually know where things come from. But moving on, I just wanted to touch and direct this question to you, David, actually. So critical mineral supply chains are opaque, and there is, especially if we look at Africa, for example, a challenge with geopolitics and dealing with China's influence. So I just wanted to get your take on how do we work around some of those geopolitical issues, because as we've already talked about, we need to collaborate on this. We need to have a greater drive on helping to formalize the sector. So I just wanted to get your views on the challenges and how to possibly overcome them.
Well, of course, one way is obviously, let's say cobalt is to try and find, in alternative locations where cobalt can be mined, with the caveat that a new mine, especially if it's sort of constructed on a large scale, can licensing, exploration and licensing and bringing into production can take, well, I think the average is 13.5 years. So I think that's one of the challenges is we need to diversify away from single source of supply, i.e. China, for an awful lot of these minerals, and they played a long game. From the going out policy, I think under Deng Xiaoping of 2005, I might have got that slightly wrong, and then other policies being put in place, and in the Belt and Road, of course, to facilitate the supply of stuff going to China, where they sort of essentially then value add by processing, refining, and so on, and they don't leave that essential, as it were, technology transfer into the source nation, such as Eastern DRC, Zambia, and so on and so on. So I think that's one of the challenges. But I think there is another challenge, and we come back to this. Some of the sort of jurisdictional and mineral specific challenges is that the end market is not actually a stable market. So we've started off with battery-powered automotive. Jeff helped me do this, wrote a paper about 5 years ago, actually I shoved in front of the government, to say that if we don't secure the input volumes of stuff we need for gigafactories, then we will lose 130,000 people, top tier workers out of our automotive industry here in UK. And it looks as though that is beginning to, come to, some sort of truth, according to the SMMT. So the key to that, with this overdependence on things like lithium and so on, with a potential crash of your own domestic labour market in automotive, is to go and invent a different type of propulsion system. It could be hydrogen based. When you think of battery versus hydrogen power packs, and thinking also of wind power. Well, we're now looking at small modular reactors being built fairly rapidly now. First one coming in 2030, I think. Small modular reactors, in order to diversify the demand market away from the vulnerabilities in the supply chains. Otherwise, we lose automotive. Otherwise, all of our wind turbines would be still made in China and then shipped, across the world, to us here in UK. So I think those are, I think, my points is, and if you don't have the stability of the demand, then investing in the supply becomes challenging, because investors will say, well, what's the long-term future in all of this stuff I'm putting into, lithium or cobalt and so on, as we're trying to formalize the supply chains, and definitely out of ASM. Rob, you're an investor.
Well, so education is so fundamental, because number one, do policy setters, do investors, do end customers understand that we don't have enough critical minerals in the pipeline? Maybe, maybe not. That 5 years ago, they definitely didn't. Today, they're somewhere. So getting past that, do they understand that ASM is an opportunity in that space? Well, probably not. So there's work to do on what that looks like. Going past that, do they understand that there are two potential approaches with ASM? One makes you feel good, but it accomplishes nothing. And it says, it's not responsible, therefore let's avoid it. So you're further eviscerating the poorest of the poor, and you're not increasing supply. The other approach is let's change outcomes, let's change the way it looks like, which makes a whole lot more sense because it's lifting up both dignity and supply and development. And then in that context, David, what are the geopolitical and economic implications of all of it? Are markets changing? Yes. What are the dynamics between China and the US and Europe and others? Well, there aren't a whole lot of things more important than energy security out there. And energy security depends on critical minerals. So will there be substitutions? Yes. But there are also reasonable, supportable assumptions on what we're going to look like 5, 10, or 25 years down the road, recognizing long times from pre-exploration to operation, and then longer lives of mines from there. And based on that, part of it's a geopolitical reality, because by definition, there's a very, like you said, there's a very patient, very methodical approach that China's used, but it's different in terms of what's left on the ground compared to the notion of responsible mining practices that truly engage, that truly formalize, that truly build capabilities. So thinking about the end-to-end and baking that into business case logic is all about understanding what the opportunity really looks like. And for an investment marketplace, it's fundamental stuff, and it's where we're going to need to end up in the pretty near future to drive at scale formalization.
Absolutely. And part of the challenge with Western players, I suppose, is the lack of midstream capability, right? So, you know, China has the processing and the refining plants, whereas, you know, we're still in that early stage of that journey where we are trying to raise finance to build these plants, whether it's the US, Europe, or somewhere else. And of course, there's the argument of, well, more value should be retained within Africa, whether it's Latin America or Central Asia. So trying to manage some of those geopolitical realities and government ambitions is quite challenging, as well as the commercial realities of companies not really wanting to engage or seeing it as too risky. I just want to open up the floor to all of you now about some final comments on some of the solutions that perhaps have been floating in your head, or just any further thoughts before we jump into the questions with the audience days.
So I'll open it up. My overriding thought is, or perspective, there needs to be a sense of urgency here. We're not going to have enough supply of critical minerals. The geopolitics speaks for itself. The economics speaks for itself. There's a sector with tens of millions of participants. So getting this right is about energy security and financial security at the end of the day. So really, now's the time to roll up our sleeves and make a difference when it comes to ASM formalization. It also delivers socially. It requires multiple end-to-end collaboration, like Terry was talking about a few minutes ago. But the sense of urgency is fundamental that we need, because time is a-ticking. The energy transition's getting further behind the 8 ball, and dealing with that fundamental reality is delivering capacity through ASM, which is on the table.
Yeah, and I think that mining is already happening by the artisanal miners in every one of the metals that can be regarded as critical, including many that haven't been listed in so far today. So the mining is already happening. The need is out there already. The investors are poised to do something. The question is the role of people like myself and others who are probably listening in on this call, this webinar this afternoon. What role can we play in bringing together the manufacturer who would like to have the critical minerals at their fingertips rather than through other countries, and the miners themselves? And I think that our role should be is along the lines of de-risking. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I've been blogging about this as well. And that is, how can we, the people that are on this call, pretty much, think about ways of de-risking the situation from the investor's perspective, improving production, helping the small-scale miners, and generally bringing together the two needs, the miners' need for more production, better livelihoods, better health and safety, and the West's needs, for want of a better word, to have more and more critical minerals. And so my hope as a result of today's conversation is that most people on this call will start asking questions not about avoiding this, but how can we move towards de-risking the situation for the benefit of everyone. Thank you.
I think I've got a couple of points here. I think just on your last point there, Terry, we should never forget, and I sometimes think it is overlooked by a lot of the players, about the advantages of persistent and ubiquitous space-based observation of the supply chains to find out where the land is being ravaged or lack of investment in, the stay behind benefits, of critical minerals, i.e. the agriculture and so on, but also to call out the polluters, the bad practice, to try and, because what we need to do is to improve the visibility inside the supply chains. And Rob, you made, the point that, it just seems to emerge, somewhere in that current bun. The other thing which I think we need to be looking at, same point really, is putting the supply chain data together in a meaningful way to reduce opaqueness or opacity inside the supply chains. And I'm not suggesting something like blockchain, where you're almost sort of tracking each gram of gold coming out of sub-Saharan Africa or so on. But it needs to make better sense to everyone, with more clarity and the interrelationships of all the players, and that needs to be presented in a meaningful and relatively simple way. And I suggest, through visualization of those linkages, dependencies, and therefore risks.
Thank you for that, David. Rosanna, anything to add? Or am I putting
Yes, I'll try because I think it's very hard to speak last on final conclusions, but probably I'll put there one word, which is inclusion, right? And I think it really works well from the perspective of the miners. They need to be included in the economy they are already contributing to, as Terry said. It's true the supply chains might be opaque today, but they're happening. There are already entrepreneurs, in particular from Asian countries, that are willing to risk and already putting capital, even small capital, into this supply chain. So we're not talking about something eventually happening, it's already happening as we're speaking. So start thinking about inclusion from that perspective, but also from the mining sector perspective. I think, can we revolutionize the way we think about the mainstream mining, instead of, when we say mining, picturing large machinery like only this large pit, open pit, or big underground mining? Can we think about as a sector that integrates big players but also smaller players, because probably that is needed from a socioeconomic development perspective of the producing countries, but also we're seeing from a supply security perspective, those who are willing to source and secure those minerals. Other sectors do that already, right? We have many economic sectors that have a combination of big and small players, right? So probably breaking that misconception a little bit that is bad. So opening up the mining sector also to greater diversity of actors and investing on that and finding ways to do so, because I think that remains a fundamental challenge that has not been addressed yet.
Absolutely, and we cannot forget about the people on the ground. So we've just got about 5 minutes now to run through some of the questions. So we've got quite a few. I'll try to do my best to get through as many as possible. So we've got one about formalization of ASM. Is it a top-down approach? And the comment is, I feel it should be inclusive of current processes at grassroots levels. Would anyone like to tackle that one?
Yeah, go please, Terry.
Yeah, exactly. Grassroots is where it needs to begin, because they're in the situation. It's their ecosystem, to use a word that was used earlier. And so they do need to be very much involved with all of this. We need to start within the ecosystem. Where can we move to from there. But again, it's not going to be done by people on their own, because right now they're doing it anyway without being formal. And so it is, again, a collaborative thing between those who want whatever it is these guys are mining and the miners themselves. How do we move them down the spectrum of formalization?
And if I can add to that, only also understanding the incentives and motivations, right? Because as Terry said, like, I mean, most miners don't feel the need for formalizing because then they don't see the advantages of that, right? So if we want it really not to be top down, but bottom up, I think we need to also start understanding how can formalization improve the lives of the people we're all speaking about today. So I think that is the question, to really turn that upside down.
Thank you both for that. Sorry, go on,
Every
Rob.
place is, thanks. Yeah, every place is different. Every place is unique. Flexible frameworks, by definition, are about the grassroots. They're about engaging based on the local reality. And otherwise, how do you drive towards building trust and relevant solutions? So it speaks for itself.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So the next question is from Kenneth, who says that the conflict is between the formal and informal sector. So the informal sector is preferred as it gives the opportunity to exploit. Any comments on that one?
That's a tough one. Very true. It's very true. There are people who benefit from informal situations. There always are. People benefit in any situation. And so, yes, in some cases, certain governments, certain actors in certain areas are much happier the whole thing is informal, even as far as we used the word earlier, illicit.
I think that one's slightly controversial, so we'll move on to a question from David. In order for the sector to attract foreign institutional investors, then its governance standards must increase. If junior miners are struggling for capital, proposing to build best-in-case class mines, what is the key sell here? I think that's been answered to some extent about driving value for the people involved in the sectors, but I'll leave you to add more to that.
Yeah, it's being very clear on the business case. Are there opportunities for blended finance? Yes. Are there opportunities for RDBs? Yes. Are there opportunities for mining and impact investors? Yes and yes. But all those yeses come together when there's clarity on the business case. And the business case is a combination of social gain and value through productivity. And as the realities of the sector are better understood, the more obvious it gets that there's tons of opportunity based on social gains and productivity to be had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the challenge is attracting those foreign institutional investors who are quite unwilling at the moment to stick their money into the formal sector, given the financial situation and especially some of the geopolitical issues around price manipulations or, for example, the nickel scenario going on at the moment. So I'm going to go to Jeff's question, who unfortunately has been hiding behind the screen as his internet was too shoddy to join us for the moderation part of the session. So he's asking, will governments around the world be able to get their heads meaningfully around this within the next 5 years? Now, I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to governments getting their heads around complex issues, but I'll leave it to you guys to tackle.
There's a burning...
responsible governments, realize that there are things called the Paris 2050 goals, where, the clock's ticking down, all the time. And unless we actually get on and start fixing some of these, as it were, international mechanisms, including consolidation of market demand and so on, if we don't get on with it soon, we're not going to hit Paris 2050.
Absolutely.
Some governments will be better than others. But at the end of the day, there's a burning platform. We don't have the supply in the pipeline of critical minerals, full stop. So for them to get their heads around this, it's about energy security and financial security. So the incentive is there and it's massive. But, like we all know, some governments will get there faster than others.
I can add on that because I think it's easy to fall into being pessimistic these days, but I think I'll take it from a pragmatic point of view, and I want to build to a question that Terry said before, like what can people in this virtual room do? And I think it's also about education, not assuming that the government hold their solution to everything, to every problem, that they understand every problem at the speed and on the level they should, right? I think we're living in a world with several challenges, and the ASM sector, from what we observe, is still a niche topic. If we think about it, really understanding its economic, its social dimension, and broader, it's really something that is not necessarily out there for everyone. So I think here, Rob said it before, again, education and raising awareness about the sector being there, existing, and what it could do, could help potentially government maybe doing something within the next 5 years, which is very urgent and needed.
Well, let's hope so, that there will be some action taken. So we are on time now, but I'm just going to ask 2 last questions, and then hopefully maybe we can answer some of the questions via emails if our panelists are open there. So Kenneth has asked, should refining and value addition take place in host countries? Now, within the CMIA, we've worked quite closely with various African nations about building out midstream capacity. Of course, every nation is different. They have their own challenges, but building refining plants is not an easy task. You have to have reliable access to power, you have to have infrastructure, expertise, and access to finance. And I think what keeps coming up across the conversations, not just in ASM, but critical minerals, is the challenge of attracting finance. So there is much more to be done on that. And then the final question is around, there's a significant risk to the artisanal miners, and how do we minimize some of that based on the returns that they see? Can we help artisanal miners to mitigate those risks and improve their returns? Is formalization something that can help that?
I think there is a model I've seen, and it's to do with artisanal and small miners in Chile through this government organization called Empresa Nacional de Minería, where these small families who dig out the copper, if they hit the rock, and if it's the right color, they just keep on digging, where the government will provide a guaranteed price per ton, depending on the grade of the ore that is being dug out by these families, put on the back of a truck and taken down to an NME depot. They get the guaranteed price, and if it sells on the open market for a better price, then they give that extra benefit back to the miner. If the markets are low, then the government absorbs the loss, and so that guaranteed price creates that confidence for the small and medium miners, so that they can see that they've got a persistent and survivable business, rather than being everyone's sort of giving up the ground and heading off down to Santiago or to Antofagasta, to go and work as taxi drivers or whatever. So there are models out there.
Absolutely.
David used the phrase persistent, survivable business. So one way of thinking about that is developing capacity. Another way, hand in hand with capacity, is fit for purpose governance. So formalization isn't a destination, it's kind of a journey. You're gradually building capacity, you're gradually building fit for purpose governance. As you do that, you're lowering vulnerability, you're enhancing dignity, you're enhancing their ability to engage. So thinking about it in those terms matters, because vulnerabilities go down as capacity goes up pretty directly.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for joining us today. Fantastic insights from our panelists. And thank you all for listening in and all your wonderful questions. Apologies that we can't get to all of them today. The recording and Rosanna's wonderful presentation will be available after this. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. There's so much work to be done in this space. We've talked about transparency, supply chain data, education, finance, which keeps cropping up as the #1 issue, and of course, inclusion, and not forgetting about the people that this truly impacts. So thank you all very, very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you may be in the world. So thank you and bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.